Greetings, everyone. My name's Sam. I'm 21, I'm a musician and actor, and all my life I've been dyspraxic. It's given me some difficult moments, but despite some minor and occasionally major inconveniences, I'm pretty pleased with my life so far. I'm Sam Wilkes, and welcome to Adventures in the Life of a Dyspractor.
1, 2, 3, 4. Don't ask him to catch a ball or to find a local cafe. He won't catch the ball at all, and he'll just get lost on the way. He'll baffle you with his logic and on a clock until the time of day. He just about wrote this song, but he used 3 of the easiest chords to play. G, C, D. Adventures in a life, adventures in a life, adventures in a life, oh. Adventures in a life, adventures in a life of a Dyspractor. He's a Dyspractor, a dyspraxic actor. The
Episode 5. Sand, Swings and Santa. Christmas time. I don't remember the year. I remember that I was at nursery school, which means it must have been one of the years that happened before 2002 did, although I suppose it could in fact have been 2002. Since I was only born in 1998, it's unlikely to be 1992 or 1995, because although my parents were married in those years, it would have been unwise to refer to them as mum and dad, because at that point they weren't anybody's mum and dad. Come to think of it, I didn't exist, so it would have been strange to refer to them as anything at all. Let's say it was 2001. This fits because not only was I alive in 2001, but I would only have been 2 or 3 years old, young enough to excuse me now remembering hardly anything at all about this anecdote, other than the fact that I was, in fact, alive. The main thing I remember is a feeling of fear and unrest, to put it lightly. I remember kicking off about something, properly freaking out, bawling, tears streaming down my face. It is clear to me that I must have come into contact with something properly frightening, something so terrifying that it shook me to my core and left my traumatic reaction to it firmly lodged in my memory. The horrifying thing in question? A small animatronic model of Father Christmas. Yes, really. In trying to fill in some of the blanks and establish the context of this bizarre mental image, I discovered after quizzing my parents that this model made its debut as part of our Christmas show, in front of all the kids at nursery, along with all our nursery teachers and, even worse, all of the parents. It is, I have discovered since studying acting for my university degree, unwise to break character and kick off mid-performance because of unexpected things happening that didn't during a rehearsal. I think, however, if I did not quite understand this at 3 years old, I could be forgiven for getting completely freaked out by the sudden appearance of a small laughing man seemingly gate-crashing our performance. It is a fact that as a small child, I was scared of animatronics, much as I wouldn't have been able to express this in such words at the time. This early traumatic experience can most easily be explained by the heightened sensory awareness that is common in dyspraxics. This sensitivity to sound and movement, amongst other things, affects me in a number of other different ways. If any friends of mine that might be listening to this have ever suggested going to the beach with me, you may have noticed that this plan probably never came to fruition. Perhaps I said I couldn't come because I had a delivery coming, or perhaps I just admitted up front that I am, quite frankly, not a fan. The aforementioned heightened sensory awareness means that I've had a lifelong aversion to mess, and sand seems to me to be the very embodiment of it. It gets everywhere. You head down to the beach on one occasion searching for relaxation, and 2 weeks later you're finding sand in your bed, around the house, in your shoes, and the texture is so weird. It is one of those few things in life that I quite genuinely cannot see the upside of. Another would be snow, which is basically overhyped cold rain that people like to roll up in a ball and throw at you without asking for your consent. As if that isn't bad enough, they expect you to join in. Unnecessary and cruel, in my view. One thing I do have to be thankful for is the fact that people don't behave like that with sand. Imagine people making sand balls and chucking them in your face. Whether you like sand or not, you'd probably hate it. So why then do people find it acceptable to behave that way with snow? Whether you're as sensitive as I am about it, it cannot possibly be anything other than a bad idea. In an earlier episode of this series, I waxed lyrical about children's play areas. For those who don't know what waxing lyrical is, don't worry, it's not as painful as it sounds. It just means I spoke enthusiastically about it. But this enthusiasm for such places as a child emphatically did not extend to swings. Well, that's not entirely true. I very much liked to be on my own in a play area and sit on a swing as if it were a seat, gently rocking ever so slightly. But the second someone tried to push me on it, I absolutely hated it. I liked to be in control, safely occupying my own space, but the second someone took me out of my comfort zone and pushed me, I would scream to get off. It's dizzying. You go to heights that can only be unsafe on something that you're likely to fall off. And for a dyspraxic child, the motion was overstimulating. It was, quite frankly, more excitement than I was willing to experience. Back when I was in primary school, each child had a visit from a nurse who would test their hand-eye coordination, eyesight, hearing, etc. When conversing with my mother during the session for me, the nurse asked, "How is he with swings?" Of course, I absolutely hated them. And let me guess, he won't put his hands down on the grass. Indeed, this was another area I was vastly uncomfortable with. Something about the texture of it, perhaps? It was this conversation that eventually led to my diagnosis as dyspraxic. The most obvious and still very prevalent example of this heightened sensory awareness, or perhaps HSA, or HSA, if we're attempting to abbreviate such an unwieldy phrase, is the sensory overload I sometimes experience if too much is happening around me at one time. In large moving crowds of people particularly, my mind just shuts down and sort of fails to process what's going on. It's very difficult to explain, but I would liken it to when you've got too many tabs open on your computer and you get that buffering circle as it tells you that Google is not responding. It's only temporary, and you know that in a moment all the pages will load correctly. It's just taking its time because it has a lot of information to process. I was very much like that, particularly back in school when having to get changed for PE. I absolutely hated PE. In fact, I don't think there was a single lesson in school that I hated more. Something about my personality that I think I've covered before is that if I don't see the point in something, I won't really try very hard at it. It's safe to say that I didn't see the point in PE. As far as I could see, when it came to things like football, people were getting far too into the game. It is, after all, only a game, like chess. Can you spot my favourite analogy for anything at all ever? I very much doubt that during a game of chess, people shout at you and call you names for not playing properly because you don't fully understand it. I don't know that though. I don't play chess. On the few occasions that I have attempted to play chess, it didn't seem as though everyone's life and mood depended on whether they won or not. It seems to be that sport is much more like Monopoly in that sense. Friendships are at stake, and it can get aggressive once people know they've lost. Another difference, of course, is that people don't randomly pull your shorts down in Monopoly or chess, as a boy called Leo once did to me in PE. I was touched that someone thought I had a nice enough bottom to get a closer look at. I just would have much preferred him to keep his fantasies involving me to himself. I'm getting off track though. The main issue here was not necessarily out in the Bennett Memorial sports field, but in the changing room. It goes without saying that the changing room for men was a horrific place, full of too much deodorant and toxic bravado. I never had the luxury I was granted back when I did swimming lessons of being allowed out 5 to 10 minutes early so I could get a head start on changing, and so I tended to stand in the same corner of the changing room I always stood in, my little error message flashing in my head, and only being able to concentrate once everybody had left for their next lesson, and I was no longer feeling overloaded. I think the one situation most dyspraxic people can agree is anxiety-inducing is a packed tube. Getting the train at rush hour is one of my least favourite things. I have to keep my head down and pretend I'm somewhere else where I'm not surrounded by people. A few years ago, I went with my family to see the play The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. If anyone hasn't seen the play or read the original book by Mark Haddon, I cannot recommend it enough. The protagonist of the book is not dyspraxic, but he does have Asperger's syndrome, which means many of his traits were very similar to mine. There was a scene where he's at the underground, and all of the people talking all kind of merge into this kind of white noise in his head, and it all becomes very loud and unbearable. I remember my mum asking me afterwards, "Is that really what it's like?" Well, obviously not exactly, but it was indeed a worthy representation. Mum suddenly understood this sense of sensory overload just that little bit better. In many ways, that show opened a lot of doors to understanding people with these kinds of autistic conditions. And that, friends, is never a bad thing. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Adventures in the Life of a Dyspractor. Join me tomorrow for the final ever episode.
He's a dyspractor. He's got the dyspraxic factor. 'Cause he's a dyspraxic actor.